When my son got married, I kept a $90 million trust fund, completely secret. My late wife left it to me, and I never breathed a word of it to anyone. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made in my entire 70 years of life. Because exactly 7 days after the wedding, his new wife showed up uninvited at my front door, with a slick corporate lawyer at her side. What she demanded, and what I eventually discovered, shattered my world. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought my gray hair meant I was defenseless. If you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you will not believe how this ends. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer, and for the last 4 decades, I have lived a quiet, unassuming life in a modest ranch-style home in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. It is a house built on memories. Every wooden floorboard, every creaking door hinge holds a piece of the life I shared with my late wife, Evelyn. When she passed away, she left behind a massive fortune from the sale of her technology patents. $90 million safely locked away in a private trust that only I controlled. But I never touched it. I continued to live on my basic pension, driving my old pickup truck and keeping the wealth a closely guarded secret. I wanted my son Lucas to learn the value of hard work. I wanted him to build his own life just like I did. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had stood in a tuxedo and watched Lucas marry Monica. The air was already thick with the familiar Texas heat. I was in my living room peacefully repairing the gears of an antique grandfather clock. The rhythmic ticking of the brass components was the only sound in the house. I had my reading glasses resting on the bridge of my nose, my hands stained with a little bit of oil, completely lost in the simple joy of fixing something broken. Then the silence was shattered by the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up through the front window. A pristine black Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway, coming to a halt right behind my weathered truck. The engine cut off and the doors opened. Out stepped Monica, my new daughter-in-law. She was wearing a sharp designer white suit, her eyes hidden behind oversized dark sunglasses. She did not look like a woman dropping by to bring her father-in-law some leftover wedding cake. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. Out of the driver's side stepped a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a tailored navy blue suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable predatory posture of a corporate lawyer. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out onto the porch, the wooden planks groaning familiarly under my boots. I offered a warm, welcoming smile, assuming there was some sort of post-wedding errand they needed help with. "Monica," I called out, shielding my eyes from the morning sun. "This is a surprise. Where is Lucas?" Monica did not smile back. She did not take off her sunglasses. She walked up the stone pathway, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a physical distance between us as if I were carrying a contagious disease. She did not say a single word of greeting. Instead, she gestured slightly with her hand, signaling the man beside her to take over. The man stepped onto my porch. He did not extend a hand to shake mine. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and dropped it onto the small patio table next to my rocking chair. The thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said. His voice was cold, rehearsed, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "My name is Bradley Thorne. I am the legal counsel representing the new owners of this property. I am here to formally serve you notice." I frowned, genuinely confused. I looked from the envelope to Bradley and then to Monica. "New owners? What on earth are you talking about? I have owned this house for 40 years. The mortgage was paid off 2 decades ago." Bradley adjusted his tie, looking at me with a mixture of pity and extreme annoyance. "Not anymore, sir. This property has been legally transferred and sold. The asset is currently in the process of being liquidated. You have exactly 72 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still occupying this structure by 8 in the morning on Friday, the local sheriff will be called to forcibly remove you for trespassing on private property. The words hung in the air. 72 hours. Vacate. Trespassing. I felt a sudden sharp ringing in my ears. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process the absurd string of sentences this stranger had just spoken to me. I looked at Monica. She was staring past me, inspecting a chipped paint spot on the porch railing, looking completely bored by the destruction of my life. "Monica," I said, my voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "What is this? Where is my son?" She finally shifted her gaze to me. She let out a heavy sigh as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Lucas is busy at the office, Harrison. He could not be here to deal with this drama. The house is sold. It is done. Bradley is just doing his job. You need to start packing instead of standing there asking pointless questions." My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying adrenaline rush. I reached down and picked up the manila envelope. I tore it open. Inside was a stack of legal documents: deeds of trust, transfer of ownership forms, sale agreements. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, looking for any explanation, any reason for this madness. Then I flipped to the last page. My breath caught in my throat. At the bottom of the page was a red county notary seal. Right next to it was a power of attorney declaration granting full legal authority to liquidate all real estate assets in my name. And right above the dotted line was my signature, Harrison Caldwell. It was a perfect match. The sweeping loops of the letters, the sharp angles. It was exactly how I signed my checks, my tax returns, my contracts. It was flawless. Except for one massive, horrifying detail, I had never signed that paper. I stared at the black ink. The realization crashed into me like a freight train. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding with the bank. This was a deliberate, calculated, and highly illegal forgery. And there was only one person in the world who had access to my old tax returns and filing cabinets to trace that signature so perfectly. My own flesh and blood. My son, Lucas. Bradley tapped his expensive watch. "I strongly suggest you start calling moving companies Mr. Caldwell. The new buyers are eager to begin renovations. I will leave my card on the table. Do not try to contact my clients regarding this matter again. Any further communication will be handled exclusively through my office." He placed a glossy white business card next to the envelope. Monica turned on her heel, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone path, and walked back to the Mercedes without looking back. Bradley followed her, getting into the driver's side. The engine roared to life and the SUV reversed out of my driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust before disappearing down the suburban street. I stood alone on my porch. The Texas sun was beating down on my shoulders, but my entire body felt ice cold. My own son and his wife of 1 week had just ambushed me. They had forged a federal document. They had stolen the house I built with my own hands. They were throwing me out onto the street like a stray dog, believing I was just a poor, defenseless old pensioner who would have no choice but to surrender. I looked down at the forged signature again. A strange, eerie calm began to wash over me. The shock was fading, replaced by the analytical precision of a man who had spent his life solving complex mechanical failures. They thought I was weak. They thought I was naive. They had absolutely no idea about the $90 million monster they had just woken up. I folded the document, slipped it back into the envelope, and walked back inside the house. I had a phone call to make. I stepped through the front door and closed it quietly behind me. The heavy oak door shut with a solid, familiar click, sealing out the oppressive Texas heat and the lingering dust kicked up by Monica's departing Mercedes. Inside the house was perfectly still, save for the rhythmic, steady ticking of the grandfather clock I had been repairing just minutes earlier. It was a sound that had always brought me peace, a mechanical heartbeat that grounded me to this space. But now each tick felt like a relentless countdown. 72 hours. That was all the time they had given me. 3 short days to erase 40 years of my life. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my boots scuffing softly against the hardwood floors that Evelyn and I had painstakingly laid down ourselves. I placed the manila envelope on the cold granite island. The air conditioning hummed to life, sending a sudden chill over my sweat-dampened shirt. I did not panic. I did not throw things or shout into the empty rooms. That is simply not how my mind works. Decades of engineering had trained me to approach sudden catastrophes with cold, detached logic. When a heavy bridge collapses or a vital turbine fails, you do not waste time crying over the wreckage. You isolate the structural weakness. You find the exact point of failure. My point of failure, it seemed, was my blind, unconditional trust in my own son. I pulled out one of the heavy wooden bar stools and sat down. My hands, still bearing faint traces of dark oil from the clock gears, reached for the documents. I pulled the papers out of the envelope again and spread them carefully across the smooth stone surface. The transfer of ownership, the quitclaim deed, the aggressive eviction notice. I lined them up with the precise, methodical care of a man reading a complex blueprint. I leaned in, my eyes fixing intently on the final page of the main legal packet. The power of attorney declaration. It was dated a little over a month ago. I ran my calloused index finger over the signature at the bottom. Harrison Caldwell. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. Whoever had done this had not simply rushed through a sloppy imitation. They had studied my handwriting with a terrifying dedication. The slight upward slant of the capital H, the deliberate sharp cross of the T in my last name, the way the dark ink trailed off at the very end of the double L. It was all there. A casual observer, even a standard bank teller, would have approved it without a second thought. But I knew my own hand. And more importantly, I knew the physical mechanics of ink on paper. The pressure applied to the pen was wrong. The signature lacked the fluid, unbroken momentum of a man effortlessly writing his own name. It was carefully drawn, not written. But knowing it was a calculated forgery was only the first step. The more pressing question was how they had managed to orchestrate this entire scheme. Monica, with her tailored designer suits and entitled smirk, was certainly cunning enough to conceive the idea. Her chilling, condescending smile on the porch replayed vividly in my mind. She had looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as an annoying, obsolete obstacle standing directly between her and a massive payday. She had stood there casually examining her expensive manicure while her lawyer handed down a swift death sentence to my peaceful retirement. But Monica did not have access to my private filing cabinets. Monica did not know where I securely kept my old tax returns, my property deeds, or my personal identification documents. Only one person had the keys to this house. Only one person knew my daily routines, my private habits, and my schedule. Lucas, my son, the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle in the very driveway he was now trying to ruthlessly steal. The betrayal began to crystallize in my mind, rapidly hardening into something incredibly sharp and dangerous. I thought back to the lawyer Bradley Thorne. He had handed me that threatening card with the cold, calculated efficiency of a corporate executioner. He had explicitly mentioned a large moving crew arriving on Monday at exactly 8 in the morning. Why Monday? I asked myself, staring blankly at the kitchen wall. Why the intensely aggressive 72-hour timeline? In the ruthless world of commercial real estate and legal evictions, 72 hours is an impossibly narrow window. It is intentionally designed to induce immediate panic. It is a psychological warfare tactic meant to completely overwhelm the victim, forcing them to frantically scramble for moving boxes instead of securing a competent defense lawyer. They desperately wanted me disoriented. They wanted me exhausted and deeply humiliated, hauling black trash bags into the back of my old pickup truck before the weekend was even over. They knew perfectly well that if I had enough time to think clearly, if I had sufficient time to boldly contest the eviction through the proper legal channels, their fraudulent power of attorney would not hold up for a single second under the strict scrutiny of a federal judge. The aggressive speed of their sudden attack was their only real tactical advantage. They were relying entirely on the arrogant assumption that a 70-year-old widower seemingly living on a modest fixed pension income would completely lack the massive financial resources and the emotional stamina required to fight back against a slick, well-funded corporate law firm. They wrongly assumed I would simply bow my tired head, pack my cherished memories into cheap cardboard boxes, and quietly disappear into whatever miserable low-income housing facility I could manage to afford. I leaned back heavily in the wooden bar stool and let out a slow, steady, calculated breath. The antique grandfather clock in the living room chimed the quarter hour. It was a beautiful, deeply resonant sound. I was not going anywhere. The naive, overly trusting father who had proudly stood in a tuxedo at his son's lavish wedding exactly 7 days ago was permanently gone. He had officially died on that front porch the precise moment Monica stubbornly refused to take off her dark sunglasses. In his place was a resolute man who secretly possessed a hidden $90 million fortune and the limitless patience required to systematically dismantle their entire criminal operation, piece by piece. I carefully gathered the fraudulent legal documents and slid them neatly back into the thick manila envelope. I stood up from the kitchen island, feeling a strange, powerful, undeniable surge of energy coursing rapidly through my veins. The crucial first phase of my strategic response required absolute, unwavering emotional control. I needed to hear my son's voice. I needed to hear exactly how he would cowardly attempt to justify this sudden nightmare. I walked deliberately over to the old landline phone securely mounted on the kitchen wall. I stared at the worn plastic buttons for a moment, steadying my racing heart. I picked up the heavy receiver, listened to the steady, hollow dial tone, took one final deep breath to completely mask my burning anger, and dialed Lucas's number. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. Dad, Lucas finally said. His tone was remarkably calm. There was no surprise in his voice. Absolutely no hesitation. He sounded exactly like a man waiting for a scripted cue. Lucas, I said, allowing my voice to tremble just enough to sound overwhelmed. What is happening? Monica was just here. She brought a lawyer. They handed me papers saying I have to leave my house in 3 days. Please tell me this is some kind of terrible misunderstanding. I waited for the crack in his facade. Instead, I heard a heavy theatrical sigh. Dad. Please calm down, Lucas said softly. I know this is a shock. I wanted to be there to tell you in person, but I was afraid of how you would react. I could not bear to see you upset. But we had to do this. We had no other choice. No other choice, I echoed, leaning heavily against the granite countertop to sell the illusion of a broken man, even though he could not see me. This is my home. You forged my signature, Lucas. You sold my house. Dad, stop it, he interrupted gently. Do not say things like that. Nobody forged anything. You signed those papers last month. You just do not remember doing it. The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. I do not remember, I asked, letting my voice crack perfectly. What are you talking about? It is not, Dad. Lucas replied, his tone shifting into the patronizing cadence one might use to address a frightened child. We have talked about this. The doctor warned Monica and me that your dementia is rapidly advancing. You are having severe memory lapses. You are becoming a danger to yourself. Dementia. I repeated, genuinely stunned by the depth of his fabrication. I have never been diagnosed with dementia in my life. I have not even seen Dr. Aris in over a year for anything other than a routine cholesterol check. Dad, you are in denial, Lucas continued smoothly. Do you not remember the gas stove incident last week? You left the burner on high. You nearly burned the entire house down. If Monica and I had not stopped by to check on you, you could have died. We cannot let you live alone anymore. It is simply not safe. I closed my eyes. The gas stove incident. The memory played back in my mind with crystal clarity. Lucas had come over to make us a pot of soup. He had specifically asked me to go out to the garage to find an old socket wrench for him. While I was outside, he must have cranked the burner up intentionally, letting the broth boil over onto the open flame. He orchestrated a fire hazard just to build a fake medical narrative against me. He had laid the groundwork for this betrayal right in front of my face. I vividly remembered wiping the greasy soot off the expensive ceramic stovetop after they abruptly rushed out the door. "I did not leave the stove on, Lucas," I whispered, injecting a note of desperate pleading into my tone. "You were cooking the soup. You asked me to go to the garage." "See, this is exactly what the doctor warned us about," Lucas said, his voice brimming with counterfeit heartbreak. "You are fabricating memories to cover up the blanks. You are confusing the details, Dad." It breaks my heart to hear you like this. It really does. But it only proves that Monica and I made the right decision. We sold the house to secure you a spot in a premier assisted living facility. We took the equity and paid for a comprehensive care package. You will have round-the-clock medical supervision, hot meals, and a safe environment. We did this to save your life. A premier assisted living facility. The words sounded luxurious, responsible, and incredibly fake. I knew exactly how much my house was worth, and I knew how much those facilities cost. The math did not add up. If they had truly secured a place for me, they would have involved me in the transition. They would not have sent a corporate lawyer with a 72-hour eviction notice and a threat involving the local sheriff. "Lucas, please," I said, forcing a sob into my throat. "You cannot force me out of my home. I built this house with your mother. Her garden is here. Her memories are here. You cannot just pack me away like an old piece of furniture." I waited in the heavy silence, wondering if the mention of his mother would pierce his armor. Evelyn had adored Lucas. She had spoiled him, protected him, and believed he would grow into a man of honor. For a brief second, the line was completely quiet. "Dad, Mom is gone," Lucas finally said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion now. The sympathy had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard pragmatism. "And if she were here, she would want you to be safe. She would agree with us. You are no longer capable of making adult decisions. You are sick. You need to accept that." The cruelty of using his dead mother to justify his crime was the final confirmation I needed. My son was gone. The boy I raised had been entirely replaced by a desperate, greedy stranger willing to discard me for a quick payday. "The movers will be there on Monday morning at 8 sharp. Lucas continued, stepping fully into his role as the absolute authority. "You need to have your clothes and personal items packed. Do not try to take any of the large furniture or appliances. Those were included in the sale of the property. Monica will bring by a rental car to drive you to the new facility. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Dad. We are doing this out of love. We want what is best for you." I took a slow, steady breath. I gripped the receiver tightly, feeling the hard plastic against my palm. I had to swallow every instinct that screamed at me to expose his lies, to tell him I knew about the forgery, to promise him ruin. But I needed more time. I needed to execute my plan flawlessly. "Okay, Lucas," I whispered, sounding utterly defeated. "Okay. I will pack my things. I am just so confused. I am so tired." "I know, Dad," he replied smoothly. "Just rest. We will handle everything." He hung up. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. The soft plastic click echoed through the empty hallway. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. They had successfully stolen my past, and they believed they had completely dictated my entire future. They were absolutely terribly mistaken. I walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water onto my face. I dried my hands on a cotton towel, staring at my reflection in the window pane above the faucet. I was old, yes, but I was far from finished. The real war had only just begun. I stood there by the kitchen sink, the cool water slowly dripping from my chin, physically grounding me in the immediate present moment. The sheer audacity of Lucas's words still echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet room. Dementia. He had planted that terrible seed with such casual, calculated precision. I dried my face completely with a cotton towel, intentionally letting the rough fabric pull me back from the dangerous edge of blind rage. As a retired mechanical engineer, I had spent my entire professional career diagnosing massive, catastrophic structural failures. When a complex system completely breaks down, you do not simply stare at the surrounding wreckage and shout uselessly at the twisted metal. You carefully trace the microscopic fault lines all the way back to their very origin. You look for the tiny stress fractures that silently appeared long before the final devastating collapse. My own son was not just lying to cover up a spontaneous, opportunistic theft. He was ruthlessly executing a meticulously designed long-term strategy. He had been quietly laying the foundation for my supposed mental decline for weeks, perfectly preparing the medical narrative, so that when the final blow eventually fell, no one in the world would ever question his motive.